Hello, I'm Bernard Norcott-Mahany. I work at the Blueford branch of the Kansas City Public Library. April is National Poetry Month, and during April I read a poem a day aloud because poems should be read aloud. Each year I do something a little bit different. This year I thought what I would do is I would look at a famous Roman poet named Horace. Horace wrote lyric poetry primarily, although he also wrote satires and other forms that are not technically lyric poems. He lived during the reign of Augustus, so the end of the first century BCE, and his most famous work are his collection of Odes, which means songs, and he's got 4 books of Odes, but he published the first 3 as a unit, and then later published a 4th book of Odes. So what I'm going to do is read from the first 3 books. I'm going to read them sort of in order, but obviously there are more odes than there are days in the month of April, so I'll only be reading some from each book. So the translation that I'm using, since I could read it in Latin, but you likely wouldn't understand, is the version by David Ferry. So David Ferry, probably the best translation of Horace out there. Lyric poetry is always sort of dicey because you can't exactly capture the same sort of magic of the poems in their original meter. English does not really work with the metrics that the Romans would have used. In fact, the Romans, Horace, is copying the Greek, so he's using a Greek metrical pattern for his Latin verse, which itself is actually sort of amazing because Latin does not lend itself quite so well to those meters, but Horace does make it work. So, first poem is the very first poem in the collection of Odes. This is Book 1, Poem 1, to Maecenas. This is a dedicatory poem. Maecenas was a wealthy man who sponsored poets. He sponsored the poet Virgil, he sponsored Horace, he sponsored some other poets. He was a good friend of Augustus, and to some extent, the works of Virgil and of Horace do their part for selling the Roman message and selling the idea of Augustus as emperor. We don't have that here. What we have in this opening poem is reference to Maecenas, then a list of jobs that people do that might get them some fame or fortune, and then Horace saying, but I've chosen to be a poet, and if the muses are on my side, then I'll succeed. Or if you, Maecenas, consider me a poet, then likewise I'll succeed. So that's sort of the gist of the poem. So here it is, Book 1, Poem 1, to Maecenas. Maecenas, you, descended from many kings, O you who are my stay and my delight. There is the man whose glory it is to be so famous, even the gods have heard the story of how his chariot raised Olympic dust, the dazzling wheel making the smoking turn. And there is he whose bliss it is to be carried up to the honors of the office on the shifting shoulders of the crowd. And he whose pride is that his barns hold everything that can be gathered from the Libyan fields of grain. And there's the man who, with his little hoe, breaks the hard soil of his poor father's farm, but all the money there is could never persuade him to venture out onto the sea, a quaking sailor. And the fearful trader in his wallowing vessel, as the storm comes on, longs for his native village and longs for the quiet fields surrounding it. And then, of course, next year refits his ship, unable to forego the profit of it. And there's the man who likes his cup of wine, taking his ease in the busiest time of the day, under the shady boughs of the green arbutus, or near the secret source of some murmuring brook. There are those who love encampments, and love the confused music of trumpet and clarion sounding together, and are in love with the wars their mothers hate. And all night long, out in the bitter cold, if his faithful dogs have startled up a deer, or if a wild boar has broken through the snare, the hunter waits, forgetful of his bride, All night the bride at home waits for the hunter. What links me to the gods is that I study to wear the ivy wreath that poets wear. The cool sequestered grove in which I play for nymphs and satyrs dancing to my music is where I am set apart from other men, unless the muse Euterpe takes back the flute or Polyhymnia untunes the lyre. But if you say I am truly among the poets, then my exalted head will knock against the stars. So that was poem 1 from book 1 of Horace's Odes to Maecenas.